Thank you for joining us on another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. My guests on this installment are State Representative Jeanne Ives, a Republican from Wheaton, and Kristen McQueary, Chicago Tribune Editorial Board member. Ladies, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. So the big news after session ended in Springfield, where the General Assembly is housed, is no budget. So since Governor Rauner is elected, now 2 sessions of the General Assembly, we have not had a state budget because Rauner refuses to sign an unconstitutionally unbalanced budget, and the Democrats in charge of the House and the Senate refused to send him a constitutionally balanced budget. So how does this end between now and November? Or do you believe what Madigan and Cullerton, the respective chamber leaders, said, that we're not even going to have a discussion about a budget until after the November election? Kristen.
I mean, that's what they're saying. So I would expect we'll do what we did last summer, which is maybe have a couple special sessions. Maybe lawmakers will get called down to deal with kind of ancillary issues, or they'll just sit around. But
like Candy Crush.
Perhaps there's evidence of that. But you know, Madigan has been pretty clear he doesn't want to put his members on any controversial votes, and the state kind of scoots along under these court orders with the budget anyway. So I just expect nothing will happen before November.
But what does that say about the Illinois electorate, that what Kristen said, doesn't want to put his members on any controversial votes? The idea of not having a budget or sending a $7 billion unbalanced budget to the governor, that's not a controversial vote. Or doing nothing is not controversial. But potentially doing something, whether it's a tax increase or programmatic cuts or restructuring, that's controversial.
Well, I think it depends on what district you live in. So if you live in a district with a lot of state workers, you're much more aware of what's going down in Springfield than if you live in a district like mine, which, you know, our schools are largely funded with property taxes. We don't require a lot of state services in the same way. And so people are just kind of uninformed, and that's part of the problem. They don't really see the effects of this. When they will see the effects of this, however, is if we don't get a K through 12 education budget, because we have a number of schools, something on the order of 100 schools that literally only have 30 days cash on hand. They can't open in August if they don't get their general state aid August 10th. And so Michael Madigan is betting on the crisis coming to fruition and he getting what he wants, which is no reform agenda, and yet the spending will continue. So he's going to wait out Governor Rauner for as long as he possibly can until this crisis of the schools opening or not comes to fruition.
Well, isn't that what they did last year? No budget. Governor, are you going to appropriate, are you going to kind of agree that we need to appropriate money for the schools to open in August? Or are you going to precipitate a crisis? And last year, Rauner said, I'm not going to precipitate a crisis, we'll do something temporary. And so we're another calendar year away from that. And we're in the same place we were last year. And so people don't believe that the crisis is real because we just keep kind of muddling along.
Well, last year they at least sent him a budget. It was deeply unbalanced, but Rauner was able to just sign the education portion. This year, they haven't sent him anything. So I think we are in a different position than we were last year.
They haven't sent him anything, and they've also rejected his idea, which wasn't always an idea he supported, but it's an idea he's supporting now, of a stopgap budget.
Right. They rejected a stopgap budget, which he was agreeable to kind of out of desperation on the last day of session. They won't send him a clean education bill, which he's asked for, which would just be education spending. So, I mean, they're just blocking him at every turn, is the way I see it.
So what about the idea then, I mean, is playing this game of brinkmanship with the Chicago Democrat leaders of the House and the Senate to the point where if those 100 schools can't open or can't stay open for more than 30 days, well, we need to precipitate a crisis to get everybody's attention and hash this out once and for all.
I think that plays into Governor Rauner's hands much better than Mike Madigan. I think then that's when people do realize that the messaging gets across. Look, the Democrats have, or the legislature has the responsibility to send a balanced budget. Spending equals revenue to the governor. That didn't happen. I think it's much easier to message that it really was Mike Madigan who held up education funding and not Governor Rauner. I think he wins on that issue. But it's how far do you send that brinkmanship? Because right now they're having to make decisions about schools. It happens in June. You're starting to register your kids. You're doing all sorts of planning. That's actually, school budgets actually happen earlier on. They happen in February, March. So our budget year's never been aligned with schools, which has always been a problem. But it's even worse, really not knowing what happens. And it's not just 100 schools, Dan. 2/3 of the school districts in the state of Illinois deficit spend. There's a lot of them that are in trouble. I'm just saying for 30 days.
But it's still a small percentage of schools that majority rely on state funding as opposed to local property tax dollars and federal grant money.
Yes, but it's one thing for our district to have 91% of its money coming from property taxes, so we only need a little bit from the state and Fed. We can make it through a school year. But a lot of these, even though they may not get the majority of the funding from the state, they can't even open knowing that they're only going to have, 60% of their money. They can't open. They literally can't open.
Well, what does that say about how schools at the K through 12 level are managed generally in this state, though? That unlike a business, for example, that budgets and strategizes for a rainy day, for a downturn, or makes difficult decisions when there is. And I'm not suggesting this is ideal or it should be precipitated for no reason, but it seems like, and then we have the same thing at higher ed, right. It seems like they want to continue to rely on ever-increasing amounts of money in perpetuity, despite the fact that we all know, or should know, what the financial picture of the state is.
Well, I think there are some districts that spend responsibly, but I think if you look at probably the majority of districts, school boards are made up of people who are not accountants, who generally are cheerleaders for the teachers. They want to support the education system, so they approve pretty generous teacher contracts. And at the end of the day, most of your property tax revenue is supporting the teachers and the personnel and the healthcare and the benefits of the system, and not the kids in the classroom.
Right. You had, and we're not even talking about poor districts.
No.
To Kristen's point, you had the Palatine, a grade school district, sign a 10-year contract with the teachers union. 10 years. You don't need to be an accountant or a lawyer, and there are a lot of accountants and lawyers in that school district, oh, by the way, to know that is insanity, to make that kind of commitment, not knowing where you're going to be 10 years down the road. But nobody does it. Even most units of government don't do something so reckless.
Well, you do it if you're the lead negotiator from the administrator side is the previous union president. That's how you get that deal.
But isn't that deal like an extreme example, but yet a microcosm of Illinois, where you've got those people that benefit, that have concentrated benefits, and they can diffuse the cost through a large population. They game the system. They're on both sides of the deal, which is why essentially 13 million Illinoisans are more or less used as spare economic parts for 2% of the population that's a member of the public sector union.
There's no doubt about it. That's what we saw this year in Springfield. So sitting on Labor and Commerce Committee, I tell you what, the crisis in Illinois did not chasten Mr. Madigan and his membership. It actually emboldened them to go for stronger things. So we've had a number of bad bills that really hurt employees and economic development. One of them, which I think should be highlighted, is that they passed through a bill that mandates that on any economic development commission and even any chamber of commerce that takes in any amount of taxpayer money, you must have on there 2 union members and 2 minority members. So then you got a board of 5. Your majority is definitely these minorities and union members. So they're emboldened by this whole conversation. They're pushing it, the conversation with pro-labor, anti-taxpayer measures. They're not chastened at all.
Look at how many votes they gave to the Ask Me bill, which would have weakened Rauner at the bargaining table. Right. No bill in Springfield gets 2-3 chances at an override. So, if you ever doubt the grip that public employee unions have over Springfield, that was a prime example. There was no vote on school funding reform or many, many important issues. There was no balanced budget, but they spent a lot of time and resources trying to jam that bill through. I've never seen a bill get that many chances at overrides.
Well, and is
right.
it to the point you've got AFSCME, SEIU, and the teachers unions, the main public sector unions, that are essentially business partners with Speaker Madigan and Senate President Cullerton. And this is one of the ways that you exercise control is through the financing they get from the public sector unions. That's one way. And the other way, and recently had a conversation with former State Senator Steve Rauschenberger about this, and this is an inside baseball thing, but in terms of the layman out there trying to understand how Madigan has such control. The other way he has such control is actually legislative process in the House, which bills get called, what the calendar is, if your bill gets out of a committee you want, if your bill is ever going to see the light of day for a vote on the House floor. Madigan controls all that.
And that's what the electorate doesn't understand, because you'll hear at the door, or you'll be in a conversation. Can't you guys just compromise? Can't you just kind of bring this to the table? Why isn't your bill accepted? You know, I filed a bill that says, look, you know what, taxpayers get to see these contracts prior to ratification and a vote. I've had it for 4 years. It's always gone to committee just to die in committee.
Collective bargaining contracts.
Yeah, collective bargaining. But I also included compensation over $150,000, so it didn't look like I was picking on unions. These bills never go anywhere by design. And so people want you to get along, you know, file the right bill. Can't you do something about term limits? Can't you do? No, the process is broken, and the process was even more broken this year. We never adopted a revenue number. We never worked in appropriations committees. We never set priorities. So everything that would happen in a normal legislative process completely failed this year. Completely.
I mean, that is really
that
is really crazy to think about the fact that even Springfield, in its dysfunction, has on occasion over the years passed a budget the way it's supposed to, where agency heads come before appropriations committees, they ask for revenue numbers, they get quizzed, they get asked about various programs, there is some measure of accountability. And then there are years where the Democrats pop a budget out at the last minute, and that's what they did this year. So there's just no back and forth. There's no chance for Republicans to really weigh in, or even Democratic lawmakers for that matter, when at the last minute they just pop a bill out like they did.
Well, and so this is a process thing, but it turns out to be really important, because this is different than other states where you've got one person that can control all of those things. And a lot of other states, how their state legislatures work, I mean, 4 or 5 legislators get together and they want to move something, then it's coming to the floor for a vote. I mean, leadership is responsive. In this state, and you saw this highlighted with the exchange between Barbara Flynn Curry, who's Madigan's majority leader in the House, and Dwight Kay, who's a Republican backbencher from southern Illinois, wanting to go line item by line item through that 500-page budget that Madigan plopped on everybody's desk 2 hours before he wanted them to vote on it. And Kay is saying, well, what's this for? Said, well, that's a continuing appropriation. Well, what's this for? Well, it wouldn't be in the budget if it didn't have value. And then the next thing, and Barbara Flynn Curry, the majority leader, said, look, no matter what you say, you want to go through this, it's a waste of time. I'm going to say the same thing with every single line item. She doesn't know what the line items in there. Nobody in the General Assembly could possibly know, because you can't read a 500-page budget in 2 hours. And the response from legitimate inquiry, line item by line item inquiry, where real money is being spent, is if it's in the budget, it by definition adds value, and or it's a continuing appropriation of something that adds value. And that's all I have to say about it. And if you don't like it, go pound sand.
But you're absolutely right. So no process, no setting of priorities. Even though I sit on one appropriations committee, at least if you had normal appropriations going on in the other committees that I don't sit on, I can trust my colleagues to have done the due diligence, maybe prioritize it, maybe understand that this is the revenue number and these are the expenses and these are what, in your area of expertise, maybe it's higher ed or general services, you know what you're doing. I could trust that. There was none of that this year on any of the budget that was passed. So there was no conversation going on, and you know, frankly, that is the problem. The state is broke. I don't know how many times I can say that. The state is broke. We have got to get rid of all the nonsense.
But people don't believe it.
And highlight that.
I don't think people believe it. They think, you know, you've got whatever 80% of the population that says Illinois is on the wrong track. Well, they get that part about it because they're living it, and they see their tax bills, and they see their job opportunities or lack thereof, and they see what's happening in higher ed and what's happening in K through 12. So they say, well, this could be better, and I've got friends in other states, and I know it's better, and I have friends that used to be here that are now in other states, and they tell me it's better, but they don't believe it because we just keep pushing it along. A credit downgrade to the state's bond rating.
That happened today.
Another $15 billion in unfunded pension liabilities for the city of Chicago.
I mean, listen, we've been a deadbeat state for years.
Right.
I mean, our bill backlog, if you don't believe we're broke, then why do we have an $8-9 billion stack of bills that we can't pay?
Ask social service providers, ask vendors to the state.
Sure. I mean, so the idea that the state does operate on what we think is probably $32 or $33 billion of income that it doesn't go to debt every year, but it's spoken for. I mean, we wouldn't have a pile of bills if we didn't. And yes, the public is not as engaged as it should be. And if the schools do come to a crisis point where they can't open, that's when it's going to have an impact. Just like teacher strikes usually are successful because you are disrupting the lives of every person who has kids in school.
Right.
That will be the breaking point in the state if it happens.
Well, but are you suggesting that it will be a breaking point the way that a teacher strike is, where the person precipitating the crisis derives most of the benefit? I mean, if schools didn't open in the fall, or a lot of schools, or they weren't open for very long, and there was the kind of disruption we're talking about, how do you think that plays out politically?
Well, I mean, Representative Ives thinks that that would put Governor Rauner in a better position because if the Democrats never gave him a budget, I just think he's not doing well as far as public relations and the messaging. I think he's losing that battle. I think the Democrats are winning in portraying him as an uncaring billionaire, and so I actually think it could be very, very bad for him.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that's right in terms of what Rauner has done messaging-wise over the last year. I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves, even though I'm sympathetic to Rauner, you're sympathetic to Rauner, you're sympathetic at least to some of Rauner's policy proposals, but he's been non-existent north of I-80. And he's allowed himself to be put into this binary position of a conventional politician, another guy down there, he calls Madigan names, Madigan calls him names, he calls Rahm names, Rahm calls him names. Everybody's friendly, but they're in a fight, and it's just about them. It's not about over anything substantive policy-wise, or to the extent it is, it's not decipherable to me. I think Rauner's messaging has been non-existent or counterproductive, and I think if we're being real honest with ourselves, he has been played like a Stradivarius by Madigan this session in particular. Is that fair?
It's somewhat fair. I think when they passed that $7 billion, that budget was $7 billion over budget, I think that there was some backlash there. And I think that's why the Senate didn't actually approve it. I think that you even saw some of Madigan's stalwart members not vote for it because I think that they knew better. So I think that was kind of a little bit of a turning point. Now, the stopgap budget that he has proposed, which I think is actually a great idea. You fund K through 12, and you do 6 months while we continue this conversation, and he got rid of his reform agenda, which we have to have reform. This state will not change unless we have the reform that's necessary.
That's not what Jim Edgar says.
Well, you know what, he's another
Former
problem.
Governor Jim Edgar says that he needs to give up the turnaround agenda and just focus on the budget. Like the two are in silos.
They're not in silos.
One is a necessity of the other. If you don't reform the structure of state government that throws off obligations we can't afford, then you can't get balanced budgets. I don't know why this evades the comprehension of Governor Edgar.
I don't either, because Ray Graham Associates sends out a 2-page letter, says, look, we had an ankle injury turn into a $650,000 workers' comp claim. We had our workers' comp costs have gone up triple in the last 5 years. We need workers' comp reform, and that is a not-for-profit serving the disability community. So the fact that that doesn't impact budget is completely false. All of these things impact budget.
I think Edgar, too, oversaw the state in a very different time. I mean, you can't even compare the unfunded pension liabilities that we're in now, series of unbalanced budgets. Yes, he was a more maybe moderate, friendly to labor unions than Governor Rauner for sure. But for the press to continually go to him as the answer to all of these problems and to try to create this friction, it just seems nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. He oversaw government when they were fighting over who was getting pork projects and where in their districts. That's right. That was the big controversy under Edgar's term. Yeah. Are we going to have a Jack Benny statue or stained glass windows in a parking garage in Naperville?
How about both?
Very
That's
different.
Right.
Well, I mean, the state was flush with cash. This was a very different time. So I just don't think his opinion should be held to the regard that it is.
Yeah,
I agree.
I'm in complete agreement. But partly, unfortunately, he's a creation of the Republican Party, because after he decided not to run for office in 1998, we put him in emergency class, and we're trying to break him out of that emergency class for the next decade for every statewide office that was open during that period of time. And it completely prevented the Republican Party from turning the page and looking forward and ushering in a new generation of leadership, which frankly is just happening in the last couple of cycles. This moribund party, from the demise of George Ryan to the election of Bruce Rauner, which is one of the reasons you have Republicans, in my opinion, in a super minority position, despite the fact you had Chicago Democrat hegemony and control of all three branches of government for 2 generations, and they've destroyed the state's economy without any political consequences. So of course Madigan and Cullerton are going to keep doing the same things. It's been working lovely for them.
That's right. And so I'd be interested actually to find out exactly how did the legislature work back in the Edgar days? What did they do differently? How was committee work? What was the relationship? What happened back then? Because it is completely broken now.
Yeah, but one of the things you had the House Republicans in charge for 2 years of his 8 years, 94 to 96. And
you had tight majorities.
And you had the Senate Republicans in charge for the entire decade.
Okay.
Republicans in charge of the Senate, so it turns out to make a big difference. And so not all policy was being driven by the governor. You also had policy being leveled up from the General Assembly to the governor, so that made a big difference. But if we're being honest with ourselves again, a little bit of equal treatment, it was Governor Edgar and Republicans who ushered in the last 25 years of playing politics with pension funds, because it was Edgar's pension ramp that went from a $14 billion unfunded liability in 94 to a $44 billion unfunded liability by the time Blagojevich took office a decade later, and then to the $120 billion it is today. It was Governor Edgar who said, we're going to push off our obligations tomorrow so that we can spend on all of these pet projects today.
I'm a rare kind of defender of that ramp.
Okay.
Because I was down there when they passed it, and there was yes, we were looking out at 2012, but there was a belief that there would be growth and that those numbers would be manageable. There was no set payment schedule at that time. They just paid into the pension funds whatever was left over after they decided the budget. So the idea of putting into statute a fixed amount was seen as a fiscally responsible thing to do. Now the legislature, over the years, they didn't even abide the ramp anyway. When they couldn't make a pension payment, they just kicked the can. They skipped it. They changed the statute. But the idea of putting it in place in the first place did make sense at the time.
Yeah, but you still have to get the numbers right. You still have to use like kind of actuarially founded numbers and not these kind of rosy 7.5%, 8% return in perpetuity.
Well, of course.
And they haven't done that. But so, I mean, Edgar's time in terms of pension politics and when the state was flush with cash, and frankly, tax increases.
Well, I'll be honest with you, I have no appetite for a tax increase. And I know what's being negotiated behind the closed doors is,
Negotiated, but with who?
Yeah, just among themselves, among the elite group of working group folks, I guess, the budgetteers, whoever.
Not legislative leaders and the governor. Just other legislators?
Other legislators that have been actually appointed to these working group committees. They're negotiating a tax increase. That entire tax increase goes nowhere but to pensions. So, I'm done with that until we do pension reform.
Well, but also, too, I mean, let's be honest, these, like, working groups of legislators that are pretending, this is like Model UN. This is like a student club down in the jungle. So, okay, look, they're having a committee meeting. Aren't they darling? What they do is irrelevant. It's irrelevant.
What do you think? Because I think some of these legislators really are, even
if you have a good idea, it's irrelevant.
They don't think that they're irrelevant, though, which is kind of funny.
Do you think they're irrelevant?
Well, they should get in on the joke.
I'm not, you know what?
I mean, in the past, when personalities got to be a problem, even under Blagojevich, even under Quinn, they had budgeteers go in a room and knock something together because the personalities of the leadership were just not going to allow that to happen. And it did work in past years.
Yeah, but when it was Blagojevich and Quinn, you had Democrats and Democrats and Democrats. Now you've got a Republican, and Democrats want to control their supermajority. So they're willing, I think, more willing to be, put out there as Madigan's Saturday night players and do their kabuki theater to set up, making sure they get funded for re-election, making sure they keep their majority and supermajority, because it's about being opposed to Rauner. It's not about trying to, where Democrats are in charge of everything, so they have to get something done.
So regardless of what you think of the working groups, if you think they're actually going to come up with something, or you think they're a joke, which, quite frankly, as somebody who sits on the pension committee but isn't in the pension discussions, who sits on labor and commerce isn't in that discussion, who sits on an appropriations committee, I'm not involved in any of these discussions. I'm thinking that, go ahead, you guys, go do what you want. I'm not interested in your result, quite frankly, because again, There's no process here, right? So we have no process, again, to actually let other people know what's going on, to let me have weigh in, or other members of the General Assembly, Democrat, Republican, weigh in on the thing. So when you have these working groups, that means you have no process. And I don't know what other states do, but we are the worst run state in the United States for a reason.
Well,
we have
Indiana
no process.
does a 2-year budget,
That's
which would be
smart.
so smart. And when they convene in January, the first thing they do is pass their budget. And then they spend the next few months doing all the little ancillary things. We do it exactly the opposite. I mean, how many days were you in Springfield, January, February, March?
9 out of 90 days.
Okay. So then we try to cram everything in the last weekend.
Well, there was a primary election to handle.
Well, of course. Everybody had to go campaign. Nobody had time to govern.
Well, but also, too, I mean, if you do the budget first, then you may not get to regulating the number of bobcats that people can kill in Illinois. And then what happens? Then you go out bobcat hunting. Can I take one? Can I take two? I don't know.
Pumpkin pie is the
voted for
official
that bill.
dessert in Illinois. We would have missed out on that important.
Well,
I like pumpkin pie.
Hey, at least we didn't regulate yoga teachers this year. We decided not to do that.
Oh, they do not fall under professional reg?
That's
But
right.
you did pass Healthy Puppy Day. At least the Senate did. So
I don't think so.
Namaste.
I didn't pass that one.
Puppy Day?
Healthy Puppy Day.
Healthy Puppy Day.
That got a vote.
Oh, don't we have a puppy lemon law too? Like if you give.
Yes,
if you,
that was
sure.
a couple years ago.
Oh, that was.
Yeah.
You were running.
Oh.
Wasn't that the gubernatorial campaign you were running in when
No.
Bill Brady got tagged as the
That's right.
anti-puppy
I forgot.
puppy hater?
I ran on the puppy lemon law. I ran the puppy lemon platform and under the puppy lemon law banner because why not? I mean, this is all so much fiction. So why not do these things, right?
Nonsense.
So let me ask you a serious question, though, not about bobcats or healthy puppies, but if we have a divided opinion on if you've essentially precipitated a shutdown of schools because they didn't have their percentage of state funding, if that's a bad idea for the governor or a bad idea for Madigan, and neither really wants that. What about this? What about this outstanding contract with AFSCME, since you brought it up, how many times they tried to pass that bill to cut Rauner out? What about the idea of 37,000 employees facing something on the order of a PATCO situation, what Reagan did to the air traffic controllers? What about precipitating that shutdown? Because here, unlike with education, Rauner has some moral high ground. Look, here's what he can say. I've negotiated 18 collective bargaining agreements in a year and a half with public sector unions who represent smaller groups of state employees. And they've taken wage freezes because all of these unions and the employees they represent understand the fiscal condition of the state, and they understand, well, I want to be secure in my employment, I want to be compensated, but I understand that everybody's got to take a hit with where we're at. So I've done that. So I'm a reasonable guy, I'm a practical guy. I was able to do it 18 times. That's some pretty good evidence. AFSCME wants to continue to live in Neverland, and they want 28% salary increase over the life of a 3 or 4 year deal. It's somewhere between $2 and $3 billion cost to taxpayers that we obviously cannot finance. So here's the deal. You can either accept my last best final offer, something that approximates the other 18 agreements that I negotiated, or we're going to put your jobs to a market test. And we're going to see how many Illinoisans who are unemployed or underemployed would like to be a mid-level case manager in the Department of Human Services making $60,000 with a guaranteed 7-figure pension. What about that? What about precipitating that? What about precipitating what essentially could be a state worker or majority state worker walkout or lockout?
I've always said this is not going to be solved until somebody starts missing a paycheck. Then the reality hits home. So right now the state employees are getting paid because that's the interpretation of the comptroller, that they should get paid even in this impasse with no budget and no appropriations.
But Leslie Munger did put them in the queue. So they're not first past the post. They're in the queue to get paid like everybody else.
No, I'm saying state employees get paid.
Oh, state employees.
State
not
employees
state
get,
legislators.
legislators were in the queue, whatever.
Yeah.
But state employees get paid.
Right.
So
right,
until
right.
somebody misses a paycheck, whether it's a teacher in my district, whether it's a state employee worker, they're just going to keep trying to push this down the road to the next election, to the next cycle, to the next, till 2018 when you have a governor's race. And we'll just see what can handle on continuing appropriations. People have even said that, even if the schools were getting close to a shutdown, it's quite possible that once again the courts would step in and make a determination that this is something that you have to fund. letting everybody off the hook and not creating that pressure point. I don't know. I'm
Well,
not
what
a
about
judge,
that? I mean,
but
look,
but until someone misses a paycheck, you're not going to have a result.
Right, and if everybody else, the 98% who are not a member of a public sector union in the state, knew the compensation levels, they make a quarter more than their private sector counterparts with guaranteed job security, essentially. If they knew the numbers and the deal and what they're demanding at other people's expense, maybe that's the revolt that we need.
I mean, that's the pressure point that I think the governor should have started with when he was sworn in and stuck with, instead of going around and bad-mouthing AFSCME, calling them AFSCAMmy, trying to do prevailing wage and right to work on a large scale right as soon as he's sworn in. I mean, this is not Wisconsin. A lot of downstate Republicans have lots of public employee union family members. So the pressure point with Rauner, which he should have taken, is where we are now with negotiating the next contract with AFSCME, not all this other, bad-mouthing public sector workers. As for a walkout or forcing them, I mean, you do have to keep in mind they are running our prisons. You have DCFS caseworkers who are checking on abused children. You can't just kind of be gunning for a walkout or force out of state workers.
Well, but at some point you have to draw a line and say, which side are you on? And so my point is to not say to be willy-nilly about dismissing 37,000 people, but to say, last best final offer, I'm telling everybody now, and this is what Reagan did with the air traffic controllers, you have this amount of time to come back over and say you're staying on the job. And if you're staying on the job, then you're on the job and you're going to get paid. And if you're not, then you're going to get replaced. We are going to move to replace people. That's what's going to happen. I mean, the predictions were it was going to paralyze air traffic in the United States. Did not come to pass. Because if you do it right, it turns out that there are a lot of people that can do the jobs that people currently do in state government. And this is not to denigrate state employees. I was a state employee for a time.
How was your pension?
I didn't last long enough to get a pension because I...
Big mistake.
Yeah, well,
Big mistake.
It was.
Although, but by the time I would be ready for retirement, I'm not sure it'll be there. But
They think it's going to be there in
well,
perpetuity.
well, sure.
Okay.
But I mean, but what about that? You can do this in a way that is responsible. And frankly, this is not eliminating people for its own sake, like you're dismissing people. This is saying, I want people who are going to work and do these jobs. And if you don't want to do them, we're going to find other people who are capable, who haven't had the opportunity to do them. What's wrong with that? The 37,000 state employees, this is their birthright to do the job they do in state government on their terms? No.
So here's what happens at local government level. You basically come up with a contract, you settle a contract, and in this case, there's quite possibly no contract, which means that then the governor sets the contract rules. Because if that contract is expired and he's no longer operating on that contract after all this has been negotiated with the lawyers and everything, you've got a contract. If their demands are so high that we can't afford it, people get laid off. That's what you do at the local government.
Right.
Look, you want all these price increases, you want salary increases, a bump here, higher payments on less co-pays on your health insurance, everything else. Guess what? That costs real bodies. So we're going to have to cut 3 police officers, 2 firefighters, and 10 from public works. So in 2008, when the crisis hit and the tax money started to decline, City of Wheaton lays off like 37 people. It happens all the time. That's what you do when you can't afford the contract. And that's what I said on the House floor. Look, you know what? I'm talking to the state workers here. Listen up. You need to get a hold of your leaders because it's your job at stake, not theirs. It's your job. That's the problem.
Even Quinn, to his credit, at one point, when they sent him an unbalanced budget that included raises, he said, I can't honor these raises for AFSCME workers. Now that has worked its way through the courts.
That's right.
$64 million of back pay for AFSCME workers is in that House budget that Madigan and co. passed. $64 million for back pay dating back to 2011 over the Quinn controversy.
So you just start laying off workers, completely non-essential workers. Start with the secretaries. Managers, you don't have secretaries. You just start laying off staff. That's what you do.
Shutting down agencies.
Except the problem here is that they have such onerous work rules that if you wanted to make a move for like 7 people, And in fact, this is what one department head, who will remain nameless, said to me: we need to backfill and make moves for 7 people. It took 42 moves with other state workers to fill the 7 positions that we want. And we don't get to pick the people we want because it's all based on seniority. But that's kind of what you do.
Here's what I think is happening too politically, and I think it's paralyzed Rauner to some extent. It's harder than he thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. He thought that these people were kind of people that were going to negotiate, or people that were reasonable, or people that he was a member of a wine club with, and at the end of the day they'll be able to cut a deal. And the Democrats are very good at aligning interests and playing power politics, and they will not relent. And they won't relent because they see Republicans relent all the time. And the reason Rauner's numbers are upside down now is not because he's done anything wrong, but he has kind of been exposed to this point, and I think this is counter to who he is, perhaps bad staff advice and counsel. He's kind of been exposed to somebody who's not going to fight. And isn't this the whole conversation, is when is somebody going to stand up and fight for my interests come hell or high water against all of the entrenched interests? And the other challenge Rauner has is that's precisely what he said he was going to do as a candidate. And however he's fighting internally, and he is standing up against a lot of pressure to just sign off on another unbalanced budget, he's not doing that, and he deserves credit for it. But the perception is we're not moving forward. Hopelessness is on the rise again after there was some renewed hope that change could come to Illinois with Rauner's election. And he's not being perceived as taking up that mantle to be the maverick that he ran as. And so people just kind of throw up their hands and say, it's just all the same again, and nothing's ever going to change in Illinois, and let's just join everybody else in plotting our exit strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think he thought he came in with a mandate where when he had these dueling press conferences with Madigan and Cullerton, which just happened again this week, that the public was going to rise up and support him. And that just hasn't happened. I mean, in most races...
Like, we've never heard this rhetoric directed at Madigan and Cullerton before.
All the time.
Right.
It's a decade, especially with Madigan. It's been going on for decades. Republicans have been unsuccessfully trying to run against Madigan and make him the albatross around every Democrat's neck, from Zion to Cairo, for 20 years since I've been in this racket. And it hasn't worked, period.
Right, but that was kind of Rauner's ace that he thought he had coming in. Sure.
So you're looking for the white knight, the person who's going to stand up for the interests maybe from people in my district. I mean, we're pretty self-sufficient. We've got the whole I-88 corridor. We've got, major corporations there. We're doing pretty well in my district. I mean, I represent part of Naperville. Naperville, considered one of the wealthiest cities in the entire country. Okay, so who's going to stand up for their interests? Because we still are losing businesses. Our property taxes are skyrocketing. People can't afford to stay there. Who is?
People having a hard time selling their homes in Naperville once you get past a certain price point, too.
That's right. That has absolutely happened. People will totally not sell. Houses are not selling because they look at the property taxes. They say, there's no way I'm paying $24,000 a year in property taxes. Not doing it, $20,000. So who's that white knight? So who would you think should be? Should be business, right? To some degree, business. Well, you know what? I hate to say it. Some of the business groups are trying to stand firm, stand up to them, but all of them think they need to still play part of the game to at least protect their own interests or get their own little thing across.
Well, that's the same thing.
So a bill that it's really bad for business, they'll negotiate with the sponsor and say, well, this is the best that we can get. We're just going to go neutral. No, you should still oppose it.
Well, right. Well, that's the same thing social service providers have. You've written often about this. Social service providers who have been played like chess pieces by Madigan and Cullerton. That's why they're having to shutter their doors, lay off staff. That's why they're owed thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And what do? They join, the lawsuit against the governor. They say, "Governor, give us our money," like he's got a money tree in the back of the governor's mansion. When it's the same people that have been playing the same games with them as the pigeon for all these years. So where are they standing up and saying, "No, it's Madigan and Cullerton. It's their fault that we're not able to provide services for our constituent populations"? Where are they? They're falling in line too. For the most part, with some exceptions.
That's right. And so there was a little bit of a debate about this on the House floor, and that's when I said, when did you care about the disabled? You've owned government for the last decade. the House, the Senate, the governorship, and you never, because it was an increase on the rates for child care, it was an increase, $15 an hour for the disabled community, for their workers. So they had a number of these bills like this. I said, hey, how come you're bringing this bill now? Where was this bill even 2 years ago? Where was this bill? No, not to be seen.
Well, right.
Not to be seen. They are so disingenuous down there on the arguments because they could have controlled all of this themselves. And so people are barking at the wrong people.
Well, but all the social service providers, here's the problem I have, is they have guilty knowledge. They know
Yes, they
Illinois
do.
was a disastrous
do.
state for social service providers for decades. This didn't happen in the last 15
That's
months.
right.
But actually, it's improved
right.
slightly. We were 51st out of 50. Now we're 47th out of 50. We shot ahead of the District of Columbia and a couple other states in provision of services for the developmentally disabled, for example. This has been going on for a long time, and obviously the providers in those spaces know it. And who are they blaming? Rauner? For what?
Well, they also,
That's right.
I think they are legitimately afraid of Madigan.
Yeah.
I think he has a
They are.
reputation,
They absolutely
well,
are.
They should admit
earned
it.
for retaliating if you speak out against him. I've heard that
Same with
for
business.
years. Right. You don't hold a press conference and stand next to this person, or
Yeah.
you risk not getting any funding. At the same time, in last year's budget, we found out later, Madigan put $35 million
yes.
of GRF money in Secretary of State Jesse White's budget to kind of hide it, and then doled that out for a new school in his district, for air conditioning for his leadership team. Where are the social service providers crying foul? You think they could use $35 million in GRF money? Not a peep. Not a peep from them. Not a peep from anybody on that issue, by the way.
You're right about that, but you may have found out afterwards. I said that on the House floor. I said he hid $35 million for his schools in the secretary. I said that, and the Democrats still all voted for it. They were fine with it too. So, I mean, all these Democrats that want to stand up and say, I'm for the disabled community, I'm for business, I'm whatever. No, you're not. You're siphoning money off all the time for the special projects that you want done, and not in a fair manner.
Kristen, I want to ask you about a column you recently wrote in the Tribune that I'm sure is generating a lot of interest from some of your former ideological soulmates. A column that started out, I'm one of the Democrats in Illinois lost.
Mm-hmm.
Why'd they lose you?
Because I was kind of probably a more naive journalist in the early 2000s, and watching, Blagojevich actually was one of the first people who had like a pension modernization task force. And I went to the meetings and I started learning about this huge ballooning unfunded liability. And then I was realizing the same people on the task force were going on the House floor and introducing pension sweetener bills. For a long time I worked at the Daily Southtown, which is South Suburban based. I was in a lot of schools in Harvey and Markham and Posen and Robbins, and watching every year the IEA and all these groups cheerlead for school funding reform. I rode a bus down with protesters, and then they would endorse candidates and funnel money completely based not on a candidate's position on school funding, but how they were going to protect pensions. So there were just a bunch of things over the years where I learned that I was getting played, and that's kind of what the column was about.
So, Jeannie, in addition to Kristen's columns and John Cass's columns at the Tribune, what is it that the Republican Party should be doing, perhaps starting with the governor, so that more scales fall from more eyes?
We've actually told the governor, both the House and the Senate members have told him, look, we need you to be out there all the time in media. And he should have a press conference right there in Bedford Park. He should go to the shuttered facility that moved to Indiana and have a press conference. And he should do it every single day. He should be up on media. People are not paying attention yet. It's now summertime, the weather's gotten nicer, they're a little bit distracted, but he can't let them be distracted. He's got to be very targeted in his messaging, and he's got to be relentless in delivering it.
I'd like
That's
to see
what he's
him,
got to do.
back to the Southland and the Southtown, I'd like to see him at a kitchen table for a family in Flossmoor with a $250,000 house that has a $20,000 property tax bill.
It's unreal.
It's death. And that's what's happening in the south suburbs, which is why so many of these communities are demilitarized zones. I'd like to see him talk about the immorality of that, and that is that we can never resuscitate those communities that have seen a transition, manufacturing leave and so forth, families leave to go across the border with those kind of economics, because you are tethered to your house unless you want to take a complete bath And that's not right. I'm going to pay for my house 3 times now, and one of those times is going to be for property taxes. That's what's happening. The south suburbs is perhaps the extreme example of it. But as we now pay the highest property taxes, not just in Chicago, but everywhere in Illinois, in the nation, that people are that is more and more creeping into people's quality of life.
Sure. I mean, I know there are proposals to freeze property taxes. I'm not sure how that would exactly work or how I feel about that. I don't know. I'm not a big government. You should, local taxing bodies are the ones charging your residents. So if you have a really high property tax bill, it's probably because your schools are spending a lot of money.
Right.
And how close attention are you paying to that? And it's one of my criticisms about everybody wants to dump on CPS, and they should, and that's fine, and I do too. But there are a lot of suburban districts where if you actually started combing through their finances, there it is, waste, fraud, and abuse. We write about it on the editorial page. You have a district, Lincoln Way, where they're having to shut schools because they passed a $90 million referendum that apparently they didn't need. So schools, if your property tax bill is high, you better be paying attention to your local school board.
I agree with you, except that we have 7,000 units of government, so it's hard to garner the energy to actually go to every single one of those entities and watch them,
Right.
Sure. And so part of the problem here is with the District 15 Palatine contract was taxpayers weren't even aware of the game being played against them. So that's one thing, is letting them know. But once they do know, there's a level here where state legislators have a responsibility to do some protective natures, protect the taxpayers to some degree. So that's why we put in the PTEL limitation, where property taxes are limited in certain districts to 5% or inflation, whichever is less. Well, another thing that we put into place was a debt limitation based on your EAV. Sure enough, what popped up the last week of Springfield this year was a debt limitation relief bill that let some library districts and some school districts exceed their debt limitation. Exceed it. So, we have a referendum, and we want to extend the bond payment out to 30 years in one case, 25 years in another case. And we had hard and fast statutes to protect taxpayers, and every time somebody needs something at the local level, they just grab their legislator, yank on his arm, say, hey, I need this bill passed. Oh, well, yeah, I'll get that done for you.
But
Roger Dodger, bipartisan way, Republican Democrats. And so we have put in measures, and we absolutely never follow our own advice when we learned from years ago what we were supposed to do. It's the same thing with the pension ramp. We just let Chicago off on their thing when we know the ramp doesn't work.
But it can happen. Belleville Township was eliminated, rolled into Belleville city government in Southern Illinois.
That's
so
right.
it's an outlier, but it can happen if you have a little bit of courageous leadership at the municipal level to say, no, we're not going to finance redundant services where these township governments, like in that case, spend 1/10 of their budget on services and 90% of their budget on salaries and benefits for the politicians and a few staff members. Well, why do we need that vestigial layer of government? We don't. Belleville made it happen. If there's courage that can be exhibited in Belleville, I don't know why it can't be exhibited in Cook and the Collar counties.
It's very
either.
hard to do. I mean, state law,
hard.
you have to get a referendum passed by
But that
all
happened.
of your local. You're giving me one example
I
out
know.
of 7,000.
I know, it's hard.
It's very difficult by design.
So, but
Yeah,
my
right.
point here is, though,
I
that
agree.
we have put in certain measures to protect taxpayers, which are reasonable measures. Even though I like local control tool, this is a reasonable measure because you cannot watch all these people and what they're doing. And then, as soon as somebody needs something, they come running to the state legislature for relief. And Chicago does it all the time.
Let me ask a final question, not to foment more hopelessness, but if nothing's going to happen until the November election, with the potential exception of money for schools to open because Rauner doesn't want to pick that scab, right? If Republicans are able to make gains, get out of the superminority in the House, not a majority, but at least get out of the superminority, maybe pick up a couple of seats in the Senate towards getting out of the superminority there as well. How does that change? What happens then? And the second scenario, where Madigan and Cullerton retain their supermajorities, what happens then? My fear is, even with more Republicans, but not a majority of Republicans, we're going to see a tax increase, we're going to see limited structural reform, because there will be Democrats winning the battle of attrition, Democrats in the majority in the General Assembly continuing to win the battle of attrition. And certainly if they retain their supermajorities, then it's even more likely, and you'll see a bigger tax increase and even less structural reform, because the people will really be despondent. Is that a fair analysis, or are you more hopeful that if Republicans do narrow the supermajorities into majorities, we could see more structural reform and less more of the same?
No, I think you're absolutely right. There are some seats that we can play in that are tighter, where Rauner won them, where the balance of power, the balance between Democrats and Republicans is a little more even, and possibly you can get the messaging in there and win a few seats. But I would say his majority is largely secured in a district that has been gerrymandered that will always ensure his power. And so I don't think, as long as he is in power, he doesn't care if he doesn't have the 71 votes, quite frankly.
No, I agree. As long as until he's in the minority, I don't think the Republicans picking up a few seats is going to make much of a difference. Maybe some short-term momentum, but I mean, he won his supermajority in 2012 after the Democrats, without a single Republican vote, pushed through the state's highest income tax increase. They didn't lose a single seat after doing that. Voters sent them all back down there. So I think he's pretty safe. The Republicans have to win something. I mean, what did you pick up, one seat last election cycle in the Senate?
Neil Anderson, Quad City.
If we go through another cycle like that, it will weaken Rauner significantly.
Do you think that without gains in November and potentially with another 2 years of a budget impasse, Rauner, no matter how much money he spends, is facing an existential threat to his political career?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, he can't, if he cannot, because I mean, this is the first time Madigan is faced with strategy, money. If he can't make a case to the voters, then yeah, he's done for.
You have long entrenched interests in Illinois that are not going to give up their special interests. They're not going to back down.
They have to be
defeated.
defeated.
The existential threat is really to every other hardworking private sector person who has had enough. They are going to leave in droves. They are going to leave in droves. That's exactly what's going to happen.
She is State Representative Jeanne Ives, Republican from Wheaton in her second term, and Kristen McQueary, Chicago Tribune Editorial Board member. Jeanne, Kristen, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thank you.